I'm pleased to introduce Joanne Parent. Joanne became a feminist activist during her student years at the University of Michigan in the late 1960s, then returned to Detroit, where her consciousness-raising group wrote the Fourth World Manifesto, and she co-founded the first feminist credit union. She moved to Los Angeles, where she was an editor of feminist magazine Chrysalis, served on the board of the Los Angeles Women's Building, a space for women artists, and volunteered with the entertainment industry's ERA campaign fund in the reproductive rights arm of the Creative Coalition. She is an author of 6 nonfiction books, a screenwriter, and is currently working on a musical. Will you please join me in welcoming Joanne Parent?
Yeah, I'm your blast from the past, a dissident from the People's Republic of California. I also was, seriously, I'm just so honored to be here. I just want to say that. I've heard such amazing talks this weekend. In the 1970s, I was an editor of that Chrysalis, and we published an early article about transsexualism by Janice K. RAYMOND. So I'm really particularly honored to be speaking in her name today. When I received the email from WDI asking for talks for this convention, I had been thinking about how in the 1970s, in the second wave movement of the second wave women's liberation movement, we experienced the same kind of hostility from male-dominated New Left groups as feminists get today, from trans activists. They both tried to divide and conquer women. So I want to tell you about that time, a little, why I think it's similar, and how our experiences might help us respond to what we face today. So in the late 1960s, I was a student at the University of Michigan, and it was a hotbed of the anti-Vietnam War activity. And my first women's group was effectively just an auxiliary of the anti-war group, but it gave us a chance as women to come together and talk to each other, because in the male-led groups, women were either ignored or expected to get the coffee. We ordered literature, and those buttons that you may remember with the women's symbol and the fist inside from Robin Morgan in New York, and we sold them on the campus diag. And I was mesmerized by those early articles, as well as my dog-eared copy of The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir. But most of the guys in the movement that I knew, an anti-war movement, were focused on anti-colonialism. They were reading books by Frantz Fanon, Herbert Marcuse, and a lot of them were carrying around Mao's Little Red Book, and seemed like, to me, cult-like ideologues who were only interested in the imminent revolution that they believed was going to happen. And I didn't think the revolution they were talking about would do much for women. So when I left campus and moved back to Detroit, I joined a consciousness-raising group where I met a lifelong friend, Kathleen Berry. Some of you may know. She was a fierce advocate for the fight against pornography and trafficking in women. But like other consciousness-raising groups, although we talked about the men in our lives who didn't do the dishes or sexual harassment at the workplace that we experienced, we also talked about our anger at the left. They were telling us that we were bourgeois white women whose frivolous demands distracted from the real revolution. An example I wanted to read you is a piece by Bernadine Dorn, a leader of SDS and the Weather Underground, who wrote in New Left Notes, "Most of the women's groups are bourgeois, unconscious, or unconcerned with class struggle and the exploitation of working class women and the oppression of black and brown women. The separatists, the man-haters, the fanatical feminists share many of the reactionary dangers of cultural nationalism." So we thought, who needs the mainstream media to ridicule and dismiss us as angry middle-class bra burners when our brothers and sisters on the left were doing it for them? The women's movement that we were part of, however, was very different from how both the left and the mainstream culture characterized it. We started the Women's Liberation Coalition of Michigan, and to work on a range of issues, and many of us in it, including Kathy Berry and myself, were from working class families. My dad was a factory worker. And I also did meet women there like Patricia Barnett, who was the new president of the newly formed chapter of National Organization for Women in Michigan. And she would come to our church basement meetings when the rest of us were in our jeans and t-shirts, and she would have expertly applied makeup and perfectly coiffed hair and pearls, and she would, sit there, and I realized in listening to her that she had been fighting sex discrimination since before I was in high school. I also met women like Faye Roberts, who would soon start the chapter of the National Black Feminist Organization, and she had been active in CORE, Congress for Racial Equality, and was tired of the sexism that she experienced in the civil rights movement. So I saw that when women come together from different backgrounds, when we focused on what we had in common, we could make important changes for women. But those in the male-dominated left continued to try to guilt trip us to keep women in their revolutionary movement. In 1972, my consciousness-raising group's anger was increased when a group of so-called anti-imperialist women wanted to have a women's liberation conference with Indo-Chinese women. That would have been fine with us if they had called it an anti-colonialist or anti-imperialist women's conference, but no, they had to take our name, Women's Liberation. And so we began to write the Fourth World Manifesto. In it, we used the language of anti-colonialism, which was in vogue then, like it still is today, and turned it around. If formerly colonized countries were the third world, then women were the fourth world. Individually and collectively, the world over, women lack the rights appropriated by men. Women are controlled and colonized either by individual men, male society, or both. Celebrated new left writers like Fanon were themselves male supremacists who expected women in the revolutionary movements to be there to serve men. Like other colonized people, many women themselves assumed internalized subservient attitudes in their new left groups, accepting that women should put aside their demands for their own rights because class struggle and anti-colonialism were more important than confronting the patriarchy. So we wrote that the anti-colonialist left had no interest in feminism, and worse, had tried to undermine the independent women's movement. And about the colonization of women, we wrote, female bodies are exploited as territory to demean, subject, control, and mock. Today, we're still trying, as you know very well, to free ourselves from male colonization of our bodies. Once again, here in the US, we have to fight for reproductive freedom. I mean, look what just happened, what we just learned about the young woman in Georgia. We have to fight against the explosion of demeaning pornography on the internet. Male violence and sexual harassment are still rampant, as they were then. And now with the spread of extreme gender ideology, we have to fight for safe and private spaces that we once had, everywhere from spas to prisons. And we have to fight to be able to compete fairly in sports with other women. And if, say, you're a young girl, maybe a tomboy or a lesbian, she has to fight gender ideology on the internet and in her school, telling her she's probably trans and should mutilate her body and take testosterone for life. Women are still colonized. Women are still the fourth world. Women are still subject to cruel misogyny and everyday sexism. In the second part of the Fourth World Manifesto, we wrote about the positives associated with female culture: emotional intelligence, love, personal relationships, cooperation, that are cultural values that are excluded from much of the male-dominated culture all over the world. And we wanted those positives, those stereotypes, basically, of women to be appreciated as human and available to both males and females rather than suppressed. But in no way did we want to reinforce superficial gender stereotypes that today are mimicked by people who have decided they're trans. We also had fun. We went to that anti-imperialist women's conference and we passed out copies of the Fourth World Manifesto. And the Indo-Chinese women there smiled and thanked us, but the American organizers soon had us thrown out. So back then, though we all, feminists and leftist groups, came together to protest the Vietnam War, in hindsight, 50 years later, the real societal revolution was brought on by the women's movement and not by the left, that soon devolved into basically becoming terrorists, setting off bombs and going underground. Ours was a movement of both radical and liberal feminists, a movement that would bring down barriers for all women and give our daughters opportunities that were actually unthinkable then. So how does our experience with the male left of yesterday relate to today? Well, trans rights activists, I believe, are following the same playbook that the male-dominated left of the 1960s and 70s, with just language changes. Feminists went from being bourgeois man-haters to bigoted transphobic TERFs. Then we were told by the left that the struggle of colonized people, working class people, and people of color were more important than women's liberation, ignoring that women are part of all of those groups. Today, we're told that the demands of trans activists are more important than women's rights. Extreme gender ideology has been able to spread so thoroughly in progressive and liberal circles, I think partly because it is based on a familiar playbook of the left that has been around for decades. That playbook consists of rehashed new left ideologies from writers like Fanon and Marcuse that everyone was reading then, and later Foucault and others, none of which are feminists, and all of which are essentially divisive ideologies. They're spread in the broader cultures through a simplistic playbook that says you're either oppressed or an oppressor. And there's a hierarchy of oppression, which we all must adopt to show that we're progressive, virtuous progressives or liberals. That hierarchy includes that all people of color are more oppressed than all whites, all colonized people are more oppressed than all colonizers. So, for example, it's okay to murder and rape Jews if you label them Zionist colonizers. And the latest commandment we are expected to follow is that all trans people are more oppressed than all women. Thus, if protecting the rights of women would also benefit a privileged group like white women, then that's bad because men who identify as women are more oppressed according to this hierarchy of oppression. So even those safe spaces for women and fairness in sports benefits black women, other minority women, working class women, it doesn't matter. Adhering to this accepted ideology, being kind to those who are deemed more oppressed, is more important than in a common sense way trying to fairly balance the rights of all groups of people. Why are so many people taken in by this playbook? Perhaps because many of the thought leaders on the left who support trans ideology or the trans activist demands have spent much of their time in academia or working for advocacy groups, and they've become invested in the ideologies they've studied, published books about, or have advocated for. They promote their ideas as the right and the kind way to be, as the truth, as the only real progressive truth. And just like their counterparts on the ideological left, gender ideologues also believe they possess the only truth, in their case that someone's belief about gender makes them more oppressed, and thus their rights and privileges should be more important in law and society than the rights and privileges due women. People in both those groups have a fierce, I think, authoritarian-like adherence to their ideology, as if it is the only correct way of thinking. In the 1970s, Kathy Berry called the demand for ideological purity on the left correct line politics. But it's also just groupthink. If you think your group possesses the absolute truth, then non-believers are evil heretics who should be canceled and attacked, as you all have experienced. Both gender and leftist ideologues are in that way remarkably, to me, like followers of fundamentalist religions, who also believe they alone possess the truth. People captured by these ideologies, in order to validate their ideas, to maintain cred in their cults, demean and cancel people who question or disagree with them. In the 1970s, Joe Freeman called this phenomena of attacking potential allies, including other feminists, trashing. An example in my life was when we started the Feminist Credit Union to help women who couldn't get credit in those days get loans without a husband, a father, or a brother co-signing for them. As the credit union grew and expanded, we were attacked by other women as capitalists, echoing the left. So today, groupthink is rampant on campuses, within social justice advocacy groups who have uncritically adopted gender ideology and attacked anyone who disagrees or questions it. And as you know, this embrace of gender ideology by the left has handed a great issue to the right in this country. Because Americans, when they actually think about it, most Americans, I think, agree that women deserve protection from potential male violence and fairness in sports. They don't understand why left-wing politicians that they otherwise may agree with on many issues want men in women's prisons or boys to compete in women's sports. So my point is that from the attack by the left on our second-wave feminists to the current attacks by trans activists and their allies on feminists today, it's the same old story. Women are thrown aside by progressive and now queer movements, which if they really were progressive, should be embracing feminist goals. The tragedy today that is even that mainstream feminist organizations like NOW have joined the parade, supporting so-called trans-inclusive athletics rather than fairness in sports for women and girls. Instead of supporting women, these groups actively try to stifle and undermine women's rights. And that's why, to me, it feels like we are in a similar place in our movement as we were in the early 70s when the left tried to suppress our movement. But much of the right today is even more extreme than what we faced with the Nixonian right then. It's in the thrall of much of fundamentalist Christian nationalism, and a demented wannabe dictator wants us to live Handmaid's Tale's lives. So how do we fight back? First, of course, continue the great work. I mean, I've just been so impressed with all of you that I've met, that you're doing to change the conversation. Your actions like the Title IX tour inspired other women to speak out. Your legal briefs, your books, your articles, podcasts, more on the issues are important to waking up people to what's happening. As so many of you are doing, we each have to continue to inspire courage in other women to speak out, because it'll take a critical mass of us, as I think was mentioned this morning. In the gay rights movement, when gay people were loud and proud, we got gay marriage. So we have to be loud and proud as feminists, just like we were in the 1970s. We need more allies, and I think they were speaking to that in the panel this morning also. When we need to support the prominent allies that we do have, like athletes Martina Navratilova, Diana Nyad, and many others who have large platforms. This may be a pipe dream that I have, but I also think we have to try to find ways to change the minds of people in the powerful leftist advocacy groups whose influence can make or break the campaigns of Democratic politicians, and so puts Democratic politicians kind of in their thrall. And that's particularly hard because of money. We were talking about also last night. And others, like your own Karadansky, have pointed out in books and in blogs, large donations have gone to these groups like the ACLU and the Human Rights Campaign, from the Pritzker, Jennifer James Pritzker, and other billionaires who support trans ideology. And when the checks cleared, then of course all these groups started to promote gender ideology. Yet there may be people who work in those groups, people who don't fully agree with gender ideology, but fearful of losing their jobs, talk gobbledygook about chest feeding and pregnant people and are sure to put their pronouns in their email. Maybe we could get some of them to start talking privately to us and to each other. Just an idea, maybe a support group for people and advocacy groups like the way Diag Democrats has become a place for Democrats who haven't drunk the Kool-Aid. Or perhaps there's another way to infiltrate and change those powerful groups that have such influence among liberal and left-wing Americans. At the very least, we have to continue to relentlessly expose how their funding from trans activists has coincided with their embrace of gender ideology. And finally, since our battle is a battle to change minds, we need to constantly find new ways to challenge the language of trans activists that has captured so many people. We have to create our own catchy, humorous, and creative ways to expose trans misogyny, like the way the Guerrilla Girls used art and humor to expose the art world's misogyny. Though it may be fun or subversive to appropriate language and call ourselves proud TERFs, that might only feed into marginalizing us. Their goal, that's their goal. The right called feminists feminazis, and we didn't adopt that term. As Toni Morrison said, the definers want the power to name. We need to take back that power. Maybe we can come up with acronyms that amplify our ideas, not theirs. Maybe say, I'm not a TERF, I'm WISE, which can mean a woman ensuring safe environments, a woman ensuring sports equity, a woman ensuring sanity in education. Or we can say, we aren't TERFs, we're FACTS, which could stand for females advocating for common sense solutions, while we continue to point out how weird, unfair, and scary to women it is when males, whatever they call themselves, parade around in women's locker rooms and bathrooms, or demand to be housed in women's prisons or, God forbid, domestic violence shelters. Whatever we say, we have to define ourselves and not let them define us. We need clear language that communicates that we are, that it is extreme trans activists and their allies whose demands are unkind, even cruel to women, not our demands. We could perhaps rewrite Kamala's mom's words and say, trans activists seem to think they just fell out of a coconut tree. They forget that their rights exist in the context of the rights of all of those who live beside them, and particularly women who worked hard for the right to safe spaces and equity in sports. Maybe Kamala and other Democrats will get it if we use the same analogy her mom used. Those are a few ideas from my experience as a second-wave feminist. Then we had to challenge the ideology of new left critics of our movement. We had to be out and proud as women fighting for the rights of all women. We had to make coalitions with women from all backgrounds to get things done. We had to stop trashing each other and learn to work together, even if we didn't agree on everything. We had to have fun and keep our spirits high. We had to use art and music and catchy slogans. And I think if we can keep doing those things today, Though it may take some time to overcome this latest backlash against women brought on by extremist gender ideologues, I think we'll succeed. As Frederick Douglass said when he was honored with other pioneers of the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls at its 40th anniversary, quote, "When a great truth once gets abroad in the world, no power on earth can imprison it or prescribe its limits or suppress it. It is bound to go on till it becomes the thought of the world. Such a truth is women's rights to equal liberty with man. She was born with it. It was hers before she comprehended it. It is inscribed upon all the powers and faculties of her soul, and no custom, law, or usage can ever destroy it." Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions. I think if there's a few minutes, I'm pleased to do so.
Hi, I have a question.
Oh, Kara.
Just on the topic of reaching out to people in these captured organizations, several years ago, I wrote an email message to the head of the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU. There's no way she doesn't know.
Because I know them. Which one? Which?
Rhea.
Oh, yeah, forget that.
So, and I wrote her this very friendly email, and I said, "I'm curious to know what you think of your organization's current stance on this topic, blah, blah, blah. I used to work there, et cetera, et cetera. If you should ever want to speak out in opposition to what your organization is saying, I am sure the radical feminist movement would welcome that." And of course, she never responded. So I'm not exactly hopeful about that. But, okay, so here's my question. One thing that frustrates me is that, to me, there's like the left and the left. And what I mean by that is there's the left as a political analysis of whatever topic, right? The leftist analysis of war, the leftist analysis of colonization. And then there's the left, meaning sort of a loose affiliation of people and political parties and institutions. And one thing that I find very frustrating is that the right in the US gets to blame the left for all of what we're struggling with. And of course I understand that it's the Democrats and the left who have betrayed women and girls. I wrote a book about it. But there is nothing left about gender ideology. Nothing. It is sexist, it is homophobic, it is authoritarian, and it is run by an industry, the likes of which we've never seen before, pharma and the medical industry and tech, et cetera, et cetera. So I can't deny that it's the left as a set of institutions pushing this. And at the same time, there's nothing leftist about it.
Exactly.
So I'm just wondering if you could address that today, and also if you have a similar analogy to what was going on in the second wave feminist movement.
It's hard to say because, I mean, what's going on today is so extreme. I mean, it's really outrageous. And it is, I think that the left back then was less establishment than the left is today. And I think that's part of the difference because when, you know, like you say, the marketing, the pharmaceutical industry and all of that has really, you know, sort of is pushing this. So that was part of it. The left that I was, you know, influenced, grew up with as a college student and so on, that left that we fought against to try to have our independent women's movement was a sort of different. It had the same playbook, the same kind of ideology, but it was different than what we're fighting today. Regarding these groups, you know, I know them too. My spouse is right now still working with the ACLU on a case that she brought, and they came in to help. And, you know, they all go around and say their pronouns. And she won't say her pronouns. And she got so mad for months or years, however long they've been working on this case, you know, she wouldn't say her pronouns. And then, you know, finally she said, "This is ridiculous." And she finally, like, blew up at them on one of the things. Anyhow, and, you know, the woman who we had hoped would become the new my spouse actually started with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the women's rights project of the ACLU, and the woman we hoped, we've had, you know, dinner with her when we get to New York, and she's like, "Yeah, it's crazy, I know, but you know, I want to work here." And so there are, I just think there might be people inside there. I think it's a pipe dream too, though. I do say that. So anyhow, anybody else who want to? Yeah, go ahead.
I want to speak to the idea of women inside, the
Same thing, okay.
Possibly even silent majority, especially when we see the national, I feel like I'm crouching here, the National Organization of Women. And I want to specifically invite every woman here to reconsider rejoining the National Organization of Women. I know that there is a movement within it. There's an organizing movement to start to assert that women are real within the National Organization of Women. And we need numbers, a reoccurring theme here. We need numbers to be present for when those impulses start to become more evident within that movement. We need women who are ready and prepared to activate within that organization.
Good idea, yeah, great. Anybody else have a question for me? Okay. All right, thank you so much, everyone.